The White House has vaunted its energy infrastructure ceasefire as an important step on the road to peace in the Ukraine-Russia war. But is that deal up in smoke? Literally. Plus, we're going to talk about the Russian economy. The Russian central bank says inflation is under control, but is this actually just another Russian lie? And why is Russia refusing to gear up in the fight against their runaway inflation? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. Okay, so this is an important story, I think, because you may see on this map here that there's a bunch of symbols that shouldn't be here, according to Russian policy, namely these drone strikes, right? Reportedly, Russia, in the last 24 hours or so, has launched explosions into Zaporizhzhia city, Odessa, as well as other regions, including Belgorod, Kherson, and Kiev itself, right? And this is pretty clear evidence of Russia continuing to target civilian infrastructure. Now, the things get even more sideways as the Ukrainians are saying that Russia has bombed its own gas pipeline in Sudzha. Now, the Sudzha pipeline, you might recall, is a critical hub for the transit of gas into Europe. But what's noteworthy is that it's a transit point, actually, for this Russian oil and gas into Europe through Ukraine. And one of the strange sort of side effects of this war is that both Russia and Ukraine actually make money from this pipeline. Russia gets to sell its oil, and Ukraine gets to collect transit fees as the oil passes through. And because both sides were getting money from this, they actually agreed that nobody should mess with the gas pipeline. And that agreement remained in effect until January 1st of this year, when Ukraine said, actually, Russia, your economy is the one who is benefiting the most. In fact, Russia's ability to sell sanction-free oil to Europe, right? One of the rules that the sanctions had was a carve-out that said if it transits over land via pipeline, it is not sanctioned. So Russia's ability to sell full-priced oil was seen as so important to them and less essential to Ukraine that Ukraine said, okay, we're not allowing this transit to pass through our country anymore. And bear in mind, guys, while the Sudzha gas metering pipeline is up here, the pipelines themselves, well, they cut all the way through Ukraine. So in terms of incentive, there's not really any tremendous incentive for Ukraine to bomb a Russian-controlled gas metering station in the formerly occupied Kursk region. If Ukraine wanted to blow it up, if that conferred some kind of benefit to them, they would have done so when they occupied the region. Or they would have done so on January 1st when the Sudzha gas pipeline deal expired, or they would have simply sabotaged any one of the hundreds of miles of pipeline crisscrossing through their country via Sudzha. So the incentive really isn't there for Ukraine to target this, though it's worth noting that for Russia, there really isn't an incentive to target it either, but Russia also isn't going to lose anything because, again, Sudzha required transit through Ukrainian territory, something that the Ukrainians were no longer permitting. And so neither side really stands to lose anything by blowing this up, and except, of course, for the blame game, which is now being played, right? The Sudzha pipeline, right, was taken out, and of course, the Kremlin is reporting that Kiev is responsible, and Kiev is saying the Kremlin's responsible, right? And of course, on Twitter, everyone else has their own takes. For example, they shared this Twitter hot take that says that actually Russia already violated the infrastructure ceasefire deal, so that Ukraine was simply returning the favor. And this is the problem, right? That Russia hit Odessa's infrastructure, causing power outages. This is something that is eminently apparent. Right? So here's the Kremlin saying, actually, it was Ukraine that targeted this gas metering station. But in the same breath, guys, Putin is saying that, Dmitry Peskov, is saying that the energy infrastructure truce is still in effect. But wait, you may say, you mean the energy and infrastructure truce, right? No. The Kremlin has now is actually saying something very different. You notice that the energy, infrastructure deal said don't target civilian stuff, don't target civilian infrastructure, and the Kremlin is saying no, we only agreed that we wouldn't target energy infrastructure, which you may note is something that really only benefits Russia, because Ukraine's strategic strikes were almost never against Russian civilian targets with no military nexus. They were exclusively targeting Russian oil infrastructure, obviously, because selling oil is what Russia does to fuel its war machine. Ukraine, in contrast, it relies on its energy infrastructure to mostly power their homes. But there's a bunch of other infrastructure that is more valuable to Ukraine, right? For example, ports and railways. These are not energy infrastructure, but they are infrastructure that is of essential importance to Ukraine. And so Russia is sitting there saying, well, actually, we only agreed to an energy infrastructure deal, and we are adhering to an energy infrastructure ceasefire. And of course, there's just absolute chaos because nobody really knows what was agreed to. Why? Well, it's probably because ultimately the agreement was never made. In fact, between Ukraine and Russia, it was the U.S. functioned as an intermediary. In fact, the president himself functioned as an intermediary. And this is a problem, is that you play these games of telephone, right? So Russia might say, oh, well, we actually were targeting Odessa because we were targeting an official state visit. We were targeting official state functionaries. It was purely an accident that it happened to target infrastructure. Right? And literally, the Oblast governor came out and said civilian infrastructure was damaged in this attack. Now, here's the thing. We got to go back. We got to say, well, what did the U.S. believe it agreed to? And the answer is, this is the official March 18th write-up by the White House, by the U.S. Embassy in Russia, of what was discussed. And you may note here that there was, let's see if we can find it here. The leaders agreed that the movement to peace will begin with an energy and infrastructure ceasefire, as well as technical negotiations. And this is really interesting because, again, let's see if we can find the transcript of their call with Trump. Let's see if we can find if Russia said the same thing. Here we go. 2 days ago, telephone conversation with President of the United States, Donald Trump, from Kremlin.ru. Let's see if we can find it. Russian side talked about these points. Right, sparing the lives. Okay, here we go. Note here. During the conversation, President Donald Trump put forward a proposal for the parties to mutually refrain from strikes on energy infrastructure for 30 days. Right? Vladimir Putin responded favorably to the proposal and immediately gave the relevant order. Do you see how there is a fundamental problem here? There is a fundamental difference to what both sides thought they were agreeing to. Nobody knows what was actually agreed to. And this is why diplomacy's hard. But this is also Russia playing a game. This is a dumb game that Russia is playing. They're pretending that they don't have good translators. They're pretending that they don't know what was agreed to. Energy and infrastructure versus energy infrastructure are different things, right? Targeting, again, this means that Ukrainian ports, Ukrainian water treatment plants, Ukrainian railways are all valid targets, whereas the only thing that is off limits is Ukrainian power plants, essentially. And this is the kind of game that someone will play if they're not interested. If Russia was sincerely interested in peace, wouldn't they choose the broadest interpretation? Because why would you want to risk violating the ceasefire accidentally if you're sincere about peace? But if you're not sincere about peace, you would choose the narrowest possible interpretation of these events. And so I think this is fundamental to understanding the sincerity or lack thereof of Putin's negotiations in this war, right? We are firmly in the game playing phase. And again, unfortunately, we count on the United States to have really good diplomacy. And this kind of error is childish. I don't know what else to tell you. This is some child level shit where nobody's really sure what they agreed to. This is why presidents get briefed to hell before they have these phone calls. This is why presidents' phone calls are so carefully structured, right? Because what you don't want to do is give someone like Putin, who is a master weasel, right? He's masterful at finding some weaselly trick and pinning them into it, right? And again, unless we hear what was agreed to, unless someone releases the actual audio of the phone call, then we're never going to know if Russia stood in violation, right? And it's going to be up to the administration to decide this. And who knows what was pitched? Who knows what Trump said? Who knows what was actually agreed to? This is where things get completely fucking absurd. This is why you can't have diplomacy run through one singular person, right? Because one person is not a reliable thing to run a country with. Even if you were a complete fucking genius, one human brain, they are influenceable, they're distractible, they are unable to keep all the world's information in their head at once, right? It's not saying that a person is dumb. It's saying that intrinsic to the human experience, right? We can only think one thought at a time. And you can't have a whole country, a whole war get negotiated by one fucking 80-year-old dude, right? It was the reason voters couldn't stand Joe Biden. It's the reason why the Biden policy was so chaotic and messy. And it's the reason that now we're continuing to see a chaotic and messy policy because the person in charge, right, is operating by total fiat. Anyway, before we talk about the other mess, which is, of course, the Russian fight or lack of fight against its own inflation crisis, I want to mention that if you are fighting your own inflation crisis, right, and maybe it's not even about the money, but it's about the energy, right? If you feel like you have been weathering strikes on your own energy infrastructure, you might need a little more caffeine. Certainly, I get it. I'm a dad. Right? And I'm obviously a content creator, and I'm still trying to pretend that I'm still a competitive athlete. And so the only way I can get through sometimes is with extra caffeine. That's why I created Strike Gum. Strike Gum has 90 milligrams of caffeine in every piece, right? It has all the energy of an energy drink, 90 milligrams. That's as much as a Red Bull, as much as an Amp Energy in just one piece of gum, plus 0 sugar. So check it out, right? We've got the 5-packs. I think that is your best deal by far. And of course, guys, if you haven't subscribed, I see how many of you guys reorder. 50% of people nearly who order Strike Gum reorder. If you haven't done the subscription, you're crazy. You're just giving me more money, which I love you guys. But honestly, subscribe and save. Get your 20% off. Jesus. Right? The link is in the description. And I'll see you guys in the next one. Right? Okay. Let's talk more about Strike Gum. All right, so the Russian central bank held their key interest rate at a 2-decade high, 21%. You may think to yourself, Paul, you covered this story already. It was 21% 2 months ago. And I would say you are sure correct, right? The central bank has come out and said current inflationary pressures have eased but remain high. And it said, but we're still leaving rates unchanged, right? They said achieving the Russian inflation target of 4% would require a prolonged period of maintaining tight monetary conditions on the economy. And Russia has a very good central banker, right? But there's a problem. And again, it's the same problem, actually, that we just talked about on the White House side. When you have a singular person running the country, is that you sometimes get these kind of blind spots. And one of the blind spots, even someone like Putin, who's very tactical, has, is that the central bank, right, the inflation rate is a double-edged sword, right? And so for the Russian economy, right, for the Russian consumer, the average Russian and the average Russian business, they are getting pounded with inflation. Take a look at this inflation rate here. This is the Russian monthly inflation rate, or rather, this is annualized inflation rate per month. You can see that in April, it started to experience a big climb up to 9.1%, really troublingly high. And then in September, the Russians deployed sold some of their foreign currency reserves to help bring down the ruble and help stabilize the situation, but not for long, right? Russia also raised its interest rates to a blistering 21%. But you see in December that the inflation simply proved too powerful for the interest rates. And you saw 8.9. So you saw it went from 8.5 to 9.5 in 60 days, increasing by over 10%, right? And then you saw in the subsequent 60 days, you saw it go from 9.5 to 10.1. And so the fact is that inflation is not under control. This is the highest Russian inflation rate we've ever seen, at least in the course of this war, right? You can see over the 3 years, actually, excluding the outset of the invasion when the first round of sanctions hit, right? So the first round of sanctions hit, but basically the Russian consumer hasn't been seen this punishing an inflation rate since February 2023. And this is not an accident, right? It is this chart should tell you everything you need to know about the sanctions against Russia, that they were brutal at first, and then Russia found a way around them. And eventually, it absolutely was able to circumvent basically all the sanctions, paying a tiny amount, for example, to import things to China and then from China to Russia, or creating shell companies to allow the importation of both military and civilian goods into Russia. And so it really reduced that inflation a little bit. But when you have the government spending a hand over fist to fund a war machine, you cannot hand wave that away. You cannot edict it away. You cannot. Economies, you cannot push an economy out a window to silence it, okay? And ultimately, this growing inflation crisis for Russia is not something they have contained. The problem is that for Russian businesses, right, 21% is viciously high. When you have these kind of high costs of borrowing, remember, many Russian businesses depend on debt to sustain themselves through a faltering economy. And this high borrowing costs are stopping them from being able to operate. In fact, a lot of small businesses are shuttering in Russia. And they say, we can't sustain this. We cannot take out loans to continue to float through this difficult economic time. And so they've petitioned Putin, I believe, to say we can't go above 21%. Right? We cannot go beyond 21%. And Putin called the central banker and said, listen, you're not going to go beyond 21%. So I am declaring it. I am unilaterally telling you 21% is as high as you will go in this inflation fight. And so let's see if we can find it here. We'll pull up that inflation rate real quick. And you notice that since October, since they've stopped it, right, raising the rates was containing the problem. But since Putin mandated that 21% is the fixed amount, you see inflation has begun to run out of control. And the problem is that there's something called the trilateral dilemma, or the trilemma in economics. And that is that you can't do it all. You can't sit there and go, you will have a 21% interest rate, right? Putin cannot dictate, you will contain inflation. You will, and you will have a robust trade system. You cannot do all three. And so for Putin, if he cares about the interest rates and he cares about the inflation rate, then he has only one tool in his toolkit. And that is what are called capital controls. And you're going to see it soon. It has to come out, right? Unless he's willing to say the inflation rate can be whatever the market says it is, which he's not going to be willing to accept because the market says that it's a runaway, exponentially growing inflation rate. But he will have to control capital, which means he's going to have to tell businesses in Russia and civilians, you cannot just pull money out of the bank. You cannot move money into other countries. He's going to have to self-sanction. He's going to have to sanction his own country. And that is going to blast a Russian because, again, it's hard for the West to sanction someone else. As you see, right? There's always a way. It's like trying to tape a box full of water shut. It's always going to seep out. And the longer you try to do it, the more it seeps out. But when it is it is inside the country, well, it's a little bit easier to do. It's a little bit more like putting a trash bag in the box and then filling it with water. It's not going to seep out as easily, right? Never discount the Russian black market. But remember, the sanctions were the era of the 15 and 20% inflation rates for Russia. So the Russian consumer is going to get crushed. They are getting crushed, and they are going to get crushed even harder. Because remember, that 10% is the official Russian inflation rate. And there's a lot of evidence that the official inflation rate is massaged pretty heavily by the Russians. Anyway, guys, that is all I had. Hope you got some value out of it. Thanks to James Sterling, Steve Moran, Doug Beck, Alan Knutson, Bastian Himmling, Brian Kelly, Del McCombs, Jay Zelwa, Henry Roos here. All of our Lieutenant tier members couldn't do it without you guys. Appreciate each and every one of you so much. Hope you enjoyed the video yesterday, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Cheers. And hit that subscribe button. It's free, and it helps.